Discipline is not this thing that you get once. It's about deciding who is in charge day in and day out. Marcus Aurelius says, do you have less respect for your nature, for your talents and your jobs than for other people who have callings? And the answer should be no. It's easy to think of discipline as this thing you enforce or this thing that is enforced on you, and that is a reality of life. That is a reality of the life you've chosen. But self-discipline is what we're talking about when we talk about virtue. It's an honor to be with all of you tonight. I want to take you back thousands of years ago in the hills of Greece. A young man is out for a walk, and he comes to a crossroads. This is Hercules at the crossroads. And there at the crossroads, he is given the opportunity to go in two directions. As the goddesses speak to him, they say, I find that you are very divided in your way of life, and you have to choose. You have to make a choice. This is what comes down to us from the ancients as the famous choice of Hercules. And what is he choosing between? He's choosing between the things that we're all choosing between. He's choosing between the easy way and the hard way, the right way and the wrong way, the short term or the long term, as John Boyd famously calls it, to be or to do. He's really choosing between virtue and vice. This is what the choice of Hercules is ultimately about. Courage, discipline, justice, wisdom, the four virtues that come together to form the ancient idea of virtue, the idea that weaves its way through the midshipman ethos that I saw from you guys, the idea of choosing between the right way and the wrong way, the easy way and the hard way. This is the choice that we all face. Tonight we're going to talk about, I think, what is the most interesting, the most critical of the virtues. I've talked about courage here before. We're going to talk about discipline, because without discipline, one doesn't have the will or the strength or the inner fortitude to bring that virtue into the world. The question of Hercules at the crossroads is interesting. Is this real? Does Hercules exist? We don't know, and ultimately it doesn't really matter whether the crossroads is real or not. It's an allegory, but it's also very real to each and every one of us. All of us face this choice in our lives. We come to the crossroads in big moments and in small moments. Two roads diverge in the wood, and we have to make choice. We're going to do the right thing or the wrong thing, the easy thing or the hard thing. We're going to think short term or long term. We're going to choose virtue or vice. Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic, would say that this crossroads we come to, these obstacles we face in life, when we come to this choice, they're vexing and difficult and troublesome in so many ways, but they're also opportunities. He says what stands in the way becomes the way. He says that any and every situation, big ones and small ones, what they provide us is the opportunity to practice discipline, to practice virtue, to elevate oneself, to become what we are capable of being and doing in any moment. So when we talk about discipline, I'm going to talk about it in a couple different angles and a couple different lenses, because discipline, like all the virtues, isn't one thing. It's not the same thing in every situation, but we come to this choice time and time again. So when we think about discipline, I think we primarily think of it in the physical context. And long after Hercules came to his crossroads, but let's say well before Jocko and his 4:30 a.m. wake-ups, long before the great writer Toni Morrison, she used to wake up in the morning. She said she had to make contact with the muses before the sun came up. She had to write as she saw the sun rising. She said it was also very important that she wrote before she heard the word mom in the morning. But the idea was, for them and for all people, that the morning, there's something sacred about the morning. There's something important about the morning. And yet, there is something timelessly difficult about the morning. In Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, he lets us know that he struggled with this as we all do. He says, at dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. He says, what do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born to do? He says, the things I was brought into this world to do. He says, or is this what I was created for, to huddle under the blankets and stay warm? Now, I first read this in college. I was not much older than you are in this room. If you're wondering what this enormous thing behind me is, this is what a computer monitor used to look like. Although I have heard some of your ships still feature these cutting-edge pieces of technology. So I was sitting there, I read this thing, and it hit me like a pile of bricks. And actually, this is my copy here. I wrote F-U-C-K double underline. And it definitely struck me because as Marcus continues, he says, but it's nicer here. The most powerful man in the world is having the same debate with himself in the morning as all of us do. He says, it's nicer here. The blankets are warm. And he says, so you were born to feel nice? He says, instead of doing things and experiencing them, he says, don't you see the plants, the birds, the ants, the spiders and bees going about their individual tasks and putting the world in order as best they can? He says, why are you not willing to do your job as a human being? Why aren't you running to do what your nature demands? So honestly, I was more saying like, fuck. It was hard, right? But that's the point. It's supposed to be hard, but you push yourself to do it. We have always pushed ourselves to do it, right? He says, people who love what they do wear themselves down doing it. They forget even to wash and eat. So as I wake up early in the mornings these days, no longer because I have a 7 a.m. class that I couldn't find a way to drop, I am getting up and trying to be excited, trying to think about the fact that I have to go and do what my nature demands, that it's a privilege to be awake and alive. And I wake up and I watch the sunrise. I try to take my kids for a walk in the morning before I get sucked into the phone. That's one of my rules. I don't touch my phone for the first 1 hour that I am awake. I try to create space between me and the device. And the first thing I do in the morning, like Marcus Aurelius, is a little meditating or journaling. I'm trying to take some time to put my thoughts down on paper, to take an inventory of myself, an inventory of what I'm trying to do, to measure myself against my progress from the day before, to set an intention or a goal for who I want to be that day and the next day. So I do this journaling, and then I go straight into my work. Now, some of you might not be morning people. I get it. Marcus clearly wasn't. He struggled. I do have a book recommendation for those of you who are struggling to get up early, and I know you do have to get up early here. This is a book that my kids also like. Getting up early is not simply a matter of sheer human willpower and neglecting taking care of oneself, right? I am proud to say that I have not taken an all-nighter since college. This isn't because I don't work hard. I work very hard. But I think about discipline. We have to think about discipline in the ancient context, which was temperance or moderation, a midpoint between two vices or virtues. When we think about discipline, when we think about something like sleep, we're not saying operate on no sleep. This is not how one operates in a peak performance environment, right? One has to have sleep discipline to have morning discipline, right? And so by going to bed, by taking care of ourselves, by planning, by not procrastinating, we make it easier to be disciplined in the morning. Admiral Stavridis, class of 76. He talks about how when he was serving in the Persian Gulf in the early 90s, he's in his mid-30s, early 40s, and he starts to feel his metabolism slowing down, and he realizes he can't pull the all-nighters that he used to pull. He can't eat the way that he used to eat. He can't get away with not exercising. He realizes he has to start taking care of himself. He has this great line in his book, Sailing True North. He says, discipline is an act of character. And I think we can think of sleep as an act of character. We can think of working out as an act of character, taking care of oneself so then one can make the hard decisions, be in charge of oneself physically. This is what we're talking about when we talk about discipline, right? Discipline is about deciding who's in charge, the lower impulse or the higher impulse, the lower self or the higher self, right? Seneca says we treat the body rigorously so that it is not disobedient to the mind. And so Seneca famously each morning of the new year would throw himself into the freezing cold Tiber River. I saw a meme after I'd prepared this talk that said, you know, it's possible to take a cold plunge and not tell people about it. It was too late for me in this talk. But The cold plunge, it's the same thing, right? Maybe there's health benefits to ice baths. Maybe it's good for your joints. Maybe it's good for your metabolism, right? Maybe it's good for a whole bunch of things. I don't really know. What I know is that it's good for deciding who's in charge, right? It's the practice of doing the hard thing that you don't want to do, knowing that what's on the other side of that is not just feeling good, but feeling good about yourself, having practiced the muscle of discipline. This is true for my physical practice. I try to do something hard every day, whether that's running or swimming or biking. I'm deciding who's in charge. I'm deciding who's in charge. So next time I hit a wall as I'm writing one of my books, I remind myself who's in charge. The side of myself that wants to quit, that thinks it's too hard, that thinks I'm too tired, or the side that knows how to push past that and pushes past it on a daily basis. And that's what discipline is. Discipline is not this thing that you get once. It's a day-to-day thing. It's about deciding who is in charge day in and day out. This is the great Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig is the greatest day-to-dayer there ever was, right? 2,000 plus games in a row, back when players traveled by train and by bus, when they regularly played double headers, when in the off season they would take a boat and play exhibition games in Japan, right? This is baseball when it was a real grind, right? This is baseball before there were helmets, right? And when Lou Gehrig eventually retired, they did some x-rays of his hands, just to give you a sense of what the day-to-dayness of discipline is. They did an x-ray of his hands, and they found that he'd broken every single bone in his hand multiple times. He played through injury upon injury. He played through getting hit in the head. He played through being sick. He pushed himself. This is the day-to-dayness of discipline. This is deciding who's in charge, right? Again, people who love what they do wear themselves down doing it. Now we can contrast Gehrig with Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth is probably more naturally talented than Gehrig, certainly more beloved in some sense, but also a sort of, as great as Babe Ruth was, a haunting reminder of what could have been. Because Babe Ruth didn't actually love baseball. He loved what baseball gave him, which was money and fame and adoration, but didn't actually love the game, not the way that Lou Gehrig did. What Babe Ruth actually loved was hot dogs. On more than one occasion, Babe Ruth ate so many hot dogs that he had to go to the hospital. This is not a story that I'm making up. And so both Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, their careers end prematurely, right? One is not anyone's fault and the other is. Both of them die tragically, shells of their former selves. They die young, worn out husks, right? One because of the tragedy of what we now call Lou Gehrig's disease. And in Babe Ruth's case, it was because of a lack of discipline. You can see him. This is a colorized photo of Babe Ruth at 52. Right? He looks much, much, much older, right? He wears himself down, not doing what he loves, not fully exploiting the potential or the gift that he was given, not the way that Gehrig did, but he wasted in excess, he wasted in spending money, he wasted in partying, he wasted in running away from what he's so good at. And when we look at Gehrig, yes, there's the tragedy of what he leaves on the field, and then there's also the sense that he didn't leave anything in the tank. One of his teammates says there was no finer man that walked the earth. He didn't drink or chew or smoke, and he was in bed at 9:30 or 10 each night. I like that to be the finest man on earth, it takes abstaining from things that you probably should abstain from and then going to bed promptly. A man who went to school with Gehrig and then is probably one of his best biographers says that clean living doesn't grow out of smugness or prudery for Gehrig. He says there was no desire for personal sanctification. It's that he had this stubborn, pushing ambition. It's that he wanted to be great. He knew that the window was tight, and he knew he wanted to take advantage of it. He said he wanted something, and being sober and clean and disciplined was the most sensible and efficient route to getting it. Marcus Aurelius says, do you have less respect for your nature, for your talents and your jobs than for other people who have callings? And the answer should be no. Muhammad Ali would famously say that when we control our lives, when we control our physical needs, when we control the lower self, we elevate ourselves, right? And that's what discipline is. And this choice is always available to us. This is the choice of Hercules. And famously, John Adams thought that the choice of Hercules, the dilemma between the higher self and the lower self, the battle for virtue against vice, he said that should be the seal of the United States of America. That's the journey we're on as people and as a country. Marcus Aurelius says that you can choose this anytime. It doesn't matter how you've been living. It doesn't matter how you've fallen off. You can choose to return to these principles anytime you choose. Just as a country, as a nation that has grown soft, that has grown away from its value, can reassert itself through discipline at any moment. When we think of the civil rights movement, I actually think we do the civil rights movement a disservice because all these years later, we have taken for granted the moral legitimacy of the cause. It is self-evident that it was right. It was self-evident that they were battling a great evil, which was discrimination and racism and white supremacy. But as a result of so imbibing on the moral legitimacy of the cause, we actually take for granted the strength and the discipline and the courage, the creativity that took to turn a country around to that very idea. The military historian Tom Ricks has a great new book called Waging a Good War, and it's a military history of the civil rights movement. He looks at the civil rights movement not simply as a moral cause, but as a moral cause that had to be brought into the world through strategy and tactics. It's a fascinating book, and basically he makes the argument that the civil rights movement is not spontaneous, it's not emotional, it's not strategic, right? It's not reactive, but it's proactive. He says that it's organized, he says that it's focused, he says that it's patient, but that it's also relentless. And he says that it's disciplined. This is Martin Luther King, moments after he was stabbed in the chest by a 6-inch knife. That's it sticking out of his chest here. And he is calmly receiving medical attention to the wound that is also on his hand. There is a famous story about Martin Luther King. He's on stage like this one, addressing a conference, and a neo-Nazi rushes the stage and begins to rain blows upon King. The audience speaks later of the sickening sound of, bone on flesh. And it's this moment, there's a collective gasp in the audience, because here is a man who has preached his whole life the doctrine of nonviolence, and here he is being attacked in front of all of his friends and supporters. The most basic of human instincts would be to protect oneself in this moment. And that's at first what King does. He puts up his hands to block himself, and then his discipline reasserts himself, the doctrine that he's taken, as he says, as his lawfully wedded wife. And observers note with almost superhuman awe, they say the way that King drops his hands like a baby and lets the blows continue to rain on him. Finally, people intervene, they take the man away, and King pauses his speech to go backstage and talk to the man to make sure that no harm has come to him. Then he takes an aspirin and he gets back up and finishes the rest of the address. This is the kind of discipline that I think we need to talk about. This is the late Congressman John Lewis after one of his many beatings, and another supporter who's casually munching on an apple. This is one of John Lewis's many mugshots, and he's smirking, the smirk of a person who is not intimidated at all by the threats that are being levied against him. One of my favorite tactics of the civil rights movement is as the marchers would get ready to begin a march, they would hold their toothbrushes aloft in the air, mocking the authorities. They were ready to go to jail. They'd packed to brush their teeth in jail that night. When we think of the civil rights movement, we think of the moral legitimacy of the cause. We don't think of the sheer discipline that it took to bring that cause into the world. John Lewis, his favorite motto was keep your eye on the prize. This is what he would sign his books to. This is what he would repeat to young people that he mentored. His point was discipline meant that when you knew what you were going for, when you knew what the most important thing was, when you know what the strategic objective is, you know what you have to stick to, you know what you have to do to get there. And his point was that one required not just the physical discipline to withstand the beatings or the intimidation, but the mental fortitude, the focus to lock on to what that prize was and not be distracted by anything contrary to that. The prize was, of course, winning the hearts and minds of the people. The prize was, of course, legislation, the protection of law for the morally legitimate cause. The Stoics talk about what we should prize. What they would say what we should prize is virtue. Marcus Aurelius says, if you can find anything better than courage and temperance and justice and wisdom. He says it must be an extraordinary thing indeed. He says we should prize what we were put here to do, our unique destiny as individuals. That's what matters. And what I think is interesting about the civil rights protesters, a way you could put this is that they could handle violence and their opponents could not handle nonviolence, right? One was disciplined and one was fundamentally not. And nothing embodies this quite like the photograph of someone poised and strong and dignified, contrasted then with someone who is out of control, ruled by passions, ruled by prejudice, ruled by fear. Epictetus says the whole point of philosophy is to get to a place that no matter what happens to you, whether it's violence, whether it's crisis, whether it's a moral temptation, he says to be able to look at that thing and say, ah, yes, this is what I trained for. So we train physically, we train emotionally to get to a point that when we find ourselves in these moments, when we find ourselves at these crossroads, we know what to do. We know which choice to make. And we not only know what choice to make, we have the strength, we have the practice, we have the skill, we have the competence to make that choice. These are the Nashville sit-in students. That's Diane Nash, famously there in the middle. And there's a story about Diane Nash that I love that I think captures how this all comes together. Time magazine, as they start to hear of the success of the sit-ins, which force the hand of the Southern authorities, which galvanizes the civil rights movement, which infuses it with youthful energy, Time magazine decides they want to do a cover story on these young students. And so they call Diane Nash, and they say, we'd like to meet with you. We'd like to put you on the cover of the largest media outlet in the country. And she says, we're really too busy. I'm sorry, I don't have time for this, right? Keep your eye on the prize. He says, this is very important. I don't think you understand how important Time magazine is. And she says, well, we're very busy. We don't have time to meet with you. He says, I really need to do this. And so finally, she calls back and says, okay, I'll meet with you at 6 a.m. in the morning before our first strategy meeting. And the reporter would later reflect, he says, the only time they could meet with me at 6 a.m., of course they were going to win. These students were so organized, so disciplined, so in command of themselves that they were already getting up at so early in the morning that he realizes that this is the most disciplined side, and the most disciplined side almost always wins. So what discipline does, it locks onto the prize and prevents us from being knocked off of it. The most famous play in America in the 1700s is a play called Cato, about one of the great Roman Stoics. It was the Hamilton of its day, if you will. And George Washington sees it as a young man. And from this play is so famous that many of the great lines from the American Revolution, give me liberty or give me death, I have not yet begun to fight. These are lines from this play, right? Everyone at that time recognized that they were cribs or allusions from this play. And they also recognized the line that Washington takes from this play, the sort of motto he builds his life around. He says that the key to success, the key to virtue is, he says, to look at everything in the calm light of mild philosophy. That one had to be in command of oneself, that one had to be able to step back and look at things from a distance, to look at them rationally, to look at them calmly. It says the calm light of mild philosophy. Nowhere is this clearer in Washington's life than the infamous Newburgh conspiracy, where a group of Continental officers set out to overthrow the United States government. Washington hears of this. He rushes to the scene and he asks to address the group of officers who are contemplating an act that would have fundamentally changed the trajectory of our nation. And Washington is, of course, quite upset. Washington could have ordered them clapped in irons. He could have given an angry speech denouncing them. Instead, he gets up on stage. He's prepared a few notes. And then he pauses, and he's sort of overcome with emotion, and he drags his notes out of his pocket, and he goes to read them. He takes his spectacles out of his pocket and he puts them on his eyes and he says, I'm sorry, men, my eyes have grown old in the service of my country. And the men begin to weep with this sort of display of calm and poise. And Washington continues. He gives this speech, sort of talking them down from the ledge, and the men disperse and America goes on as it does. It's one of Washington's great moments. It's another one of the moments where Washington looks at the anger, the frustration, the grievances of the moment, which were very real. They'd not been paid, they'd been abused, they'd been led along, they'd been let down by the civil authorities, but Washington, in the calm light, mild philosophy, manages to talk them down off the ledge. And this is what Washington does time and time again, the calm light of mild philosophy. This is his motto, this is his ethos. But this is not how he naturally is. One of the great painters of Washington spends many, many hours sitting with Washington, watching him, and what he notices that rippling, roiling beneath the surface of the calm exterior of Washington is a man of extraordinary passions, a man with a fiery temper, a man who did not like to suffer fools. And yet, he said, this is what makes Washington so impressive, is that he was not naturally this way. It's that he put an incredible amount of work. There was a lot of exertion going into being a calm and poised man. And when we think of Stoicism versus Stoicism, uppercase Stoicism, lowercase Stoicism, I think people think it is the absence of emotion, and it's not that at all. Marcus Aurelius does talk about being the rock that the waves crash over and eventually the sea falls still around. They're not saying that you're emotionless, but you have less emotions. More importantly, I think what the Stoics are saying is that we make fewer decisions out of emotion. There's a difference between getting angry and saying something out of anger. There's a difference between being upset or outraged at something and then reacting emotionally in that moment. The calm light of mild philosophy is the ability to step back, to look at an injustice like John Lewis or Martin Luther King did, to look at a profound injustice and a dehumanizing injustice and say, this is wrong, I will not stand for it. But it's going to take everything that I have to be able to defeat it. And it's going to take poise. And to react emotionally is to give my opponents exactly what they want. Eisenhower, I talked about Frost earlier, two roads diverge in a wood. Eisenhower once Robert Frost is Eisenhower's favorite poet, and Frost inscribes a book to Eisenhower, and he writes, "The strong are saying nothing until they see," which is actually a line from one of Frost's poems. It's the idea that actually the stronger you are, the calmer you are, the less likely you are to pop off, to say everything that you think. The more likely you are to be strategic, the more likely you are to wait for more information. The Stoics say that no one is fit for command who is not first master of themselves, right? They would say the greatest empire is that, to conquer the self, to conquer the lower self, to be in command of one's faculties, of one's emotions, particularly when one is provoked, when one is tempted. It's the rarest thing in the world. Lots of people have been in charge. Lots of people have gotten to high postings or had enormous success, but less rare is the person who's done so in command of themselves. If you think of someone like the late Queen Elizabeth II, think about Lou Gehrig's streak, 2,000 games, decade and a half or so of baseball. This is a person who serves every day for 70 years, never misses a day of work. And her job, unlike most sovereigns or most leaders throughout history, unlike, say, Marcus Aurelius, is that her job is not in what she does, but in what she's not allowed to do and what she doesn't say. For 70 years, she sits on the throne. She never gives an on-the-record interview. She never once interjects herself into political matters. She never once interjects with an opinion. She never once makes a mistake. She grows old in the service of her country, privileged in many ways, but also constrained in many more ways. And she embraces these constraints, these duties. She sees the meaning and the purpose in them. She never violates, there's no scandals, there's no breaking of protocol. You could argue that the finest, most dignified moment of her life comes after the death of her husband, Prince Philip. And they offer to dispense with the COVID protocols for the funeral that everyone else is at that point still following, certainly not leaders of Britain, as we would later find out. She had every right, every ability, every human reason to say, yes, I'd like to break the rules just this once, that would be nice. But she doesn't. She sits alone in the box as she grieves the person she's been married with that entire time. And this is what discipline is at a level, I think, that's profoundly deeper than just, did you get up and do your PT this morning? Did you get up promptly? Did you do your homework? This is discipline at the cellular level. Marcus Aurelius talks about loving the discipline you know and letting it support you. And it does. It supports you in the difficult moments. It supports you when things feel like they're falling apart. When I was writing Discipline is Destiny, I crashed into a wall. It's 10 books in 10 years for me. I was exhausted. And I was going through my note cards. I write my books on these note cards. And as I went through them, I found a note that I'd written to myself. It said, look, I get that you're going to crash into walls, he says, but as you go through these cards, you have to trust the process. That's what I wrote to myself. I said, trust the process, do your cards, go through them one by one, and a book will emerge. And that is what happened. I went through them card by card, day by day. It didn't feel like it was coming together. It felt like it could not take longer, but I stuck with it, and eventually the book came out. I did my practice every day. I did my work every day. There's no magical moment where it clicks, but that's not how it works. Eventually, you love the discipline you know, and it does support you. And it's not easy. We all relapse. We all make mistakes. We mess up. Marcus did, or he wouldn't have written that passage in Meditations. We lose track of the prize. But he talks about how we have to pick ourselves back up when we fail. He says, celebrate behaving like a human. And then he says, come back to the rhythm, come back to your principles, come back to the choice as quickly as possible. And that leads us to the final element or domain of discipline. We call this the spiritual domain. What I think is so impressive about someone like Marcus Aurelius, you have the most powerful man in the world. We're supposed to hear that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But again, there's no scandals. There's no deviations. There's no relapses. And yes, he is very, very strict with himself. But historians would note the interestingness that he says that the strictness is limited exclusively to himself. And actually, Marcus writes this in Meditations. His maxim for life was to be tolerant with others, but strict with yourself. And it's important that we see discipline this way. Colin Powell is an anecdote. As the Gulf War was beginning to be sketched out, he was pulling all-nighters, not by choice, but by reality. As he was pulling these all-nighters in his office, he kept it a secret. He kept it a secret because he didn't want anyone else to have to shoulder the same burden that he was shouldering, right? He kept it a secret so that his staff wouldn't have to pull the same burden that he was pulling, wouldn't have to be away from their families the same way he was. This is what truly disciplined people do. Friends of Gandhi noted that despite his insanely high standards for himself and his impoverished way of living, the minimalism with which he went through the world, that he never judged his friends. He never insisted that they live up to the same standards. He never made them feel less than for not behaving the way he did. There is some argument that he was too hard on his kids, that he tried to hold his kids to the same standard he held himself to. But as a general rule, what was so beautiful about Gandhi is, like it was for Marcus, his strictness was limited solely to himself. The same was true for Lincoln. One of his secretaries would write that he never asked perfection of anyone. He did not even insist for others upon the high standards he had set for himself. Actually, what Lincoln loved more than anything was pardoning, right? He loved the chance to give people second chances. This is a young midshipman named Chester Nimitz, class of 1905. This is him shortly before he went into Annapolis on a beer run and was spotted and made eye contact. And then when he was back on campus the next day, he noticed that the man he had made eye contact with was a newly appointed officer. And Admiral Stavridis, again, class of 76, notes that what Nimitz learns from this, he says, the young man instantly learned a lesson in whether and when to punish people who make atypical mistakes, right? This moment of mercy, this moment of clemency saves Nimitz's career. And we can imagine he appreciates it because he needs it again about 2 years later when he runs a ship aground and is court-martialed. It should have been the end of Nimitz' career, but instead, again, he's given clemency and grace. He's given a letter of reprimand instead of being bounced out, and goes on, of course, to save the free world, right? The history of the 20th century would be very different without this moment of grace, without these two moments of grace, right? When we think about what people need, tolerant with others, strict with ourselves. And it's called self-discipline, right? It's easy to think of discipline as this thing you enforce or this thing that is enforced on you, and that is a reality of life. That is a reality of the life you've chosen. But self-discipline is what we're talking about when we talk about virtue. It's the virtue of self-discipline. It's something you signed up for, right? It's standards you hold yourself to, right? You can't go around enforcing your standards on other people because they're your standards. Discipline is an outstretched hand and not a weapon we wield against others. This is General Charles Krulak, class of 64. He arrives at Quantico one day in the early 90s and expects to find an enlisted man on duty, and instead he finds Brigadier General James Mattis working the guard post. And he's shocked. What is going on? Well, the man who was supposed to be working guard duty had a family, and it was Christmas Day, and Mattis took care of it, right? Mattis, a student of the Stoics, right? Tolerant with others, strict with yourself, an outstretched hand, not a weapon. It's self-discipline. It's a burden we carry for others. We put others on our back. We don't whip people across their backs. There's a great poem about Florence Nightingale, the great nurse, the founder of the idea of the Red Cross. This is a poem by Longfellow. I think of his line often. He says of great people, of disciplined people, he says, by their overflow, they raise us from what is low. Their example makes us better. Just as calm is contagious, so is discipline. Strong people make us better. They call us to do better by their example, not by their admonishments, not by their bullying, right? Not by their criticism, but by their example. And when we think of Marcus, we should think of this. At the depths of the Antonine Plague, Marcus conducts a sale of the palace furnishings, a 2-week sale where he sells all of his luxuries, right? We think of the idea of leaders eating last. This is what Marcus leads in the greatest crisis of Rome's empire. He says, why should the Roman people suffer before I suffer, right? The leader takes the hit first. That's what discipline is. We think of Senator John McCain, class of 58. McCain could have left the Hanoi Hilton if he chose. He was given the opportunity to leave. He was given a chance to break discipline, to violate the rules, to his benefit, to the detriment of the other men there, and he chose to stay. When we talk about discipline, it's moments like that. That's the discipline that we're talking about. He would have wanted to go home every day. He would have wanted so badly to accept this exception, but he refused to do it. And when we train, this is the choice that we're talking about. These are the moments that we're talking about. When we talk about the civil rights movement, we're talking about the understanding that they eventually come to. They say, we agreed that we could only lose our lives, and in doing so, they discovered something important. They said that we could always make the last decision, that they could always choose. As Seneca said, that if they can force you, you don't know how to die. His point was that we always have the choice. No one can make us not be disciplined. Discipline is something, is a virtue, it's a strength, it's an asset that we can only relinquish. We can only let go of. We can always make this last decision. And by not making the wrong decision, by making the right decision, by choosing between the hard road and the easy way, and the easy road, virtue and vice, we have the ability to bring others along with us, which is the point of discipline ultimately. Discipline and discipleship. A discipline, a disciple. These words are rooted in the same idea. It's about being the student of something or someone. And when we think about virtue, when we think about being disciplined, I think the best way to do this is to pick a motto. The Stoics would say you have to choose yourself a Cato, as Washington famously did. Pick someone who you measure your discipline against. You ask yourself, what would they do in these situations? For Marcus Aurelius, it was his model, his stepfather Antoninus. For George Washington, it was Cato, but it was also Cincinnatus, the story from the Roman legend about the general who's called to save Rome from an invasion, given dictatorial powers. He defeats the enemy and then resigns his power within 16 days and then returns to his farm. This was the model, this was the discipleship that Washington was practicing when, not a mile from here, he resigned that commission in 1783 at the Annapolis State House. This is the moment that King George refers to as making Washington the greatest man in the world, that he passes on power, that he gives it up. And Washington is able to do this because of his motto, because of his commitment to the example of Cato and Cincinnatus. Jimmy Carter, class of 46, 25. Models his life on Admiral Rickover, who is class of 22. 25. And for Rickover, their exchange, he's interviewing Carter at an opportunity to serve on a nuclear submarine, and he asks Carter how he stands in his class at Annapolis. Carter says, I don't know, I was 100 in a class of 800. And Rickover looks at him and he says, but did you always do your best? And Carter wants to answer yes, but he catches himself, right? This is that moment. This is Hercules at the crossroads, the easy way or the hard way, the tempting way. And he decides to answer honestly that no, he didn't always do his best. There were classes that he could have tried harder in. There were books he could have read. There was physical training he could have pushed himself a little harder on. So he has to say, no, Admiral Rickover, I didn't always do my best. And Rickover looks at him and he says, why not? Then he gets up and he leaves the room. And this question, Rickover's example of doing your best, is what guides Carter the rest of his life. This is the discipline and the discipleship that he tries to practice. And then, of course, that brings us to Admiral Stockdale, class of 47. He talks of, first, being a walk-on to his high school football team, making the practice squad. He talks of the discipline that he learns, the struggle that he goes through, how this prepares him for what lies ahead. He talks about plebe summer and how that also prepares him for his time in the Hanoi Hilton. And then, of course, he is shot down, and as he parachutes down into what he knows will be, at best, imprisonment or worse, death, he says, I am leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. His quote, his favorite quote from Epictetus is, again, the idea of the choice of Hercules. Epictetus says, a podium and a prison is each a place, one high and the other low, but in either place your freedom of choice can be maintained if you wish. We always have the choice to be disciplined, whatever the circumstances we find ourselves in. We always have this choice. And that's what Stockdale practices, again, under unimaginable strain and stress and loneliness and pain and torture and humiliation. He chants to himself, control fear, control guilt, control fear, control guilt. He thinks not of himself in these moments, but how he can help his comrades be stronger, how to comfort them after they break in torture. He tries to tap on the wall their motto, US, unity over self. This is the greatness of Stockdale. And he ultimately does return home to his family. And from him, we get the ultimate embodiment of what that choice is in what's become known as the Stockdale paradox. He says, I never lost faith in the end of the story. He said, I never doubted that I would get out. He didn't know when. He says, but that he would prevail in the end and turn that experience into the defining event of his life, which in retrospect, he would not trade. Even the worst thing that a human being can be subjected to remains an opportunity for discipline. That does not make it wonderful and fun, of course not. That does not make it something that someone would seek out. But that's not what the Stoics meant when they said the obstacle was the way. What they meant when they said the obstacle was the way, that we would find ourselves in situations in life when we were tested. And it's in these moments that we decide who we are. It's in these moments that the discipline, that virtue truly matters. And that we have the chance to seize our destiny to become who we're capable of becoming. So the question I want to leave you with then is, what will you choose? What will we choose? Because this choice determines our destiny. Thank you very much. Every day, I send out one Stoic-inspired email totally for free. Almost 1 million people all over the world. If you want to take your Stoicism journey to the next level, I would love for you to subscribe. It's totally for free. You can unsubscribe at any time. There's no spam. Just go to dailystoic.com/email. Love to see you there.